6 years ago, I was doing software QA on an app that utilized the camera for stop motion animation by taking pictures at manually set intervals. It was a simple app for kids. Anyway, one night I set it to take a picture every 60 seconds and point it to the main floor of the office, leaving it to soak overnight. Coming in the next morning, I find it still running. So I stop it and review the footage to see how the app is running after the soak. Lit office with some workers. Less workers. No workers. Cleaning crew. Lights off. Darkness, darkness, darkness. Sunrise, light on. Wait. Something was different from lights off to lights on the next day. So I rewind and watch again. And again. There it was. A chair had moved at least 10 feet and spun around from lights off to lights on. So I asked around, and there were no shifts hiding in the dark. No one after the cleaning crew. No one. Nothing. I showed it to my boss and she laughed it off. That evening before I left work, I set up another soak, leaving the camera pointing in the same direction as the previous night. Only this time, there's no one at all working in that section of the office on night shift. So I decide to push all the chairs in neatly before I leave. The next day, I come in and review the footage. Again, everyone leaves. Cleaning crew leaves, lights off, darkness, sunrise, lights on. But again the chairs move. Not just one, but several, with one moving further than the others. And again I checked with everyone, and there's no logical explanation. I went on to set it up every night that week, with the last day of the test being Friday. So Friday morning would be the last time I'd see the night footage, and of course the chairs had moved again. Being the last day, I decided to check with IT and ask if there were any key scans used after 9 PM. And they told me the cleaning crews and that was it. No one could explain it, and we moved office several months later.
I was the control room supervisor at the nuclear plant I work at. 1 a.m. on a Saturday, nothing is going on, and we are bored out of our mind. Out of nowhere, over 200 alarms come in all at once along with the room lights flickering. Immediately, I turn and look. Usually flickering lights means we either had a large pump malfunction or a reactor shutdown. But we usually don't get 200 alarms at the same time. The next 10 seconds felt like 5 minutes as I'm trying to assess the status of the unit. As I turn my head from left to right, I see all of my equipment is still functioning despite all sorts of system failure and trip alarms. When my head turns all the way right, I'm looking at the reactor, and I see it's still critical, despite reactor trip alarms being in. My blood pressure immediately shoots up, and I see the rest of the crew notice the same thing. Why the hell was the core still online? Everyone was just staring at the full core display and the red control rod out. The lights were still lit. Reactor scram failures are a huge deal. They are extraordinarily rare. Only one has occurred in the U.S. commercial nuclear industry. We train for them around 40% of the time, because they require rapid actions to make the reactor safe. So when you are sitting here questioning why the reactor is still online, it really drives up the anxiety. Is this really happening? And if it is real, you have around 2 minutes to commence taking actions to reduce core subcooling to prevent core damage. The reactor control operator starts reaching for the reactor scram switch, and he turns his head to look at me and says my name. I can see it in his eyes. His heart has to be pounding hard too. Him and I have worked together long enough that I already know what he's thinking. He wants to make sure that at least one other person agrees with him before he punches out the reactor, so that if he's wrong, it's not a unilateral decision. He also is really hoping that someone will tell him he's crazy and he needs to sit back down. I finally took a long, deep breath, my first since the alarms came in. That breath re-energized my brain and I got everything thinking correctly. I took a few extra seconds to scan the panels, just to be absolutely sure. I was concerned we had to scram the core. We had reactor trip indications, which should have shut down the reactor, but it was still online. But between that deep breath and those few extra seconds, I saw it as clear as day on one of my control boards. One of our power lines went down. I look up at the generator information screen, and I see that the grid voltage just spiked off scale, high then low and stabilized. I look back down and I see some power grid circuit breakers tripped. The rest of the plant was stable, water levels stable, power level stable, coolant flow and pressure stable. Right at that time, the secondary reactor operator starts pointing at the power grid panel too. Everything made sense now. I raise my hand and I say, update. Power line 14 has dropped. We've had an electrical system perturbation. The unit remains online and stable. Everyone walk down your boards to verify system status and report back when you are complete. Reactor trip criteria was not met. Entering loss of power off normal. End of update. The reactor controls operator turns his head and sees the same thing I did. A power line went down. He nods his head, leans away from the mode switch, takes his own deep breath, presses the alarm silence button, and sits down. Just as fast as it started, I see everyone's anxiety level rapidly drop, and we start clearing the alarms. I call up the power grid, and they already had someone on their way to us. Apparently a vehicle struck a telephone pole and caused almost a mile of power line to go down pretty close to the plant. The field it was in was on fire as a result. It was pretty impressive. We've had issues in the past where a power grid perturbation from lightning strike causes a few spurious alarms, but we've never had that many come in at once. Because the perturbation was that close to the plant, it caused a deeper perturbation, and most of our alarm system basically rebooted. It's a solid state system, so it can do that, causing all the false alarms. More than anything, I felt our training and teamwork kick in. Using diverse indications to validate the condition, getting backup from the team, and taking a few seconds to stay level-headed. Our fundamentals kicked in, and we made the right decisions. Even though for about 15 seconds, I almost needed a change of pants.
I worked in a museum that was housed in an old building downtown. It was once a vaudeville theatre, a used car lot, and then it sat in disrepair for years before it was bought and remodeled. We had a lot of weird occurrences there. I am a total skeptic, but there were things I just couldn't find good explanations for. After closing the museum for the evening, we would be in the lobby counting down the cash drawers, closing the gift shops, etc. And many times, we'd hear running footsteps on the floors above us, and it was certain there was no one up there. We'd close for the night, come in next morning to open, go around and unlock the exhibits, and things would be displaced, clothes thrown all over, things knocked about, doors opened that shouldn't have been. I know they weren't like that the night before, because I would be the one who went around closing up. The place was just kind of creepy. We all felt it. There were times when you just felt uneasy, for no good reason. The elevator was very active, travelling between levels with no one in it, which would have been electrical, but still added to the creepiness factor, especially when it was dark and you could hear it going from floor to floor. Ding, ding. The biggest thing that happened, which I struggle with because I have a hard time believing it, if I'd have been alone, I would have written it off as imagination. But I wasn't alone, and they saw it too. We were standing on the second floor landing, in front of stairs that led up to the third floor. The museum was closed. All visitors were gone. As we were standing there chatting, this little boy in a red shirt came running around the corner, where the elevator was, and ran up the stairs to the third floor. It was one of those, did you see that? Yeah? Did you see that? Moments. We agreed we had both seen it, and our first thought was we had maybe missed a visitor. It wasn't a big place, and it was 30 minutes after the doors had been locked. There was only one way up to the third floor, and one way down. If there was someone there, we couldn't have missed him. We went up and looked, and of course, there was no one there. From then on, whatever weird things happened, we would just say, "It's the boy in the red shirt."
So my part-time job is chauffeuring, and I work mostly days, but I do a little night work as well. One day, I get a call from a dispatcher saying that we've got a pickup in an unusual part of town. She thought it sounded weird, but the customer said he was willing to pay cash, and she asked for cash up front, and he had agreed. Now I'm a go-get-'em kind of guy. I don't turn down runs, and I think that I can handle anything as a chauffeur, as I take down her instructions and tell her no problem, and I can handle it. This would just be another run, and whatever they throw at me, I can make it work. Right? Right. So I go to where he's supposed to be, a Waffle House in the industrial part of town, which makes no sense. I called him, and he says he's at a gas station not far down. He had been thrown out of the Waffle House. So I get to the gas station, and he gets in, and he pays me for cash for 4 hours of service. He's the filthiest and grossest looking bum you've ever seen. I've driven homeless people and whatever, but this guy takes the cake. You make it work sometimes, but this guy was full-on paranoid delusional. He told me that he was in the Secret Service and that he was engaged to Taylor Swift. I live in Nashville. Taylor Swift was and still is a major institution here in Nashville. He had me take him into downtown, and I dropped him off at some corner. He was gone for a while, and then he came back, and we just drove around for a while, and he asked me to call a number for what he said was the Secret Service. I didn't believe him, so I called the number, and it was the Secret Service. I repeated back what the guy said, and they told me to have him call the police if there was an issue. Then he gave me a number that he said was the White House. I put that one aside, and he asked me to go to an address he said was the Secret Service in town. He gets out, and since it wasn't open, he gets out on the concrete, even though there's a warm car that he's paid to be in, and starts yelling at passers-by. Once the office opened, and it was the building that the Secret Service was in, he waltzed right in. At this point, I go into a silent panic mode. I call my dispatcher saying, "I've got a crazy person and he's just walked into the Secret Service. And if he says something crazy, I might disappear." Dispatcher says not to worry about it. And soon after, the crazy guy walks out and he wants to go to a Walmart. I inform him his 4 hours are up. Then he peels off another $100 in cash. So I drive him to what was then the nearest Walmart. And 20 minutes later, he leaves Walmart, notebook in one hand, burner phone in another, and managers escorting him out. He had apparently been harassing other customers. So he wants me to take him to a hotel. And it's the dirtiest, grossest, most unsanitary roach motel I've ever seen. He wants me to put his stuff in the room, so I set the stuff in without stepping inside. And as a tip, he gives me a flea shop quality frame picture of Taylor Swift. Ironic. He was creepy, a real creepy dude. And for a short while, I thought I might disappear. That was the creepiest trip I've ever done.
I am a theatre nurse. I worked on call out of hours, and we got a call at about 2 a.m. for an emergency tracheostomy. I get there first and open up theatre, and set about checking equipment as the other staff arrive. Theatre is in the basement of the hospital, and no one at the time would be down there except us guys setting up. The 10 theatres run in the shape of an H, and there's only 2 ways in and out. I know the other exit is locked, as I've been gathering equipment from the end of the theatre. One of the nurses is at the left and side top end of the theatre, and I'm on the right side of the H, getting airways extra, when I see a lady in clothes walking along the side that my colleague is at. As this is a flying in the door emergency, I walk up to her and she looks straight ahead, and I said, "Excuse me, you can't be in here. Where are you going?" As she shuffled along, the anaesthetist shouted my name, so I run back into theatre and give him the equipment he asked for. I left the theatre to see my colleague, who was near that end, and ask him if he's seen an old lady. He thought I was bonkers, so I checked the exit and recovery rooms. She was gone. When we finished the operation, we looked everywhere, and no sign of anyone. After that, I waited to open up theatre and didn't go in alone. Spooked me right out, and I'm glad I don't work there anymore.
I used to work for a very major company I'm not going to say the name of. To put it in perspective though, when they moved into the area with their factory and the plant, they took up miles of land for the main massive building, the auxiliary buildings surrounding them, and the roads paved just for their new base of operations. They employed thousands just in this area. Anyway, I needed a job at the time and they hired me for basic security. I meant that as an actual term. There were levels of security guards here, and I was just a basic. I was basically the walking security camera that called the more proficient security guards if I saw something. Well, I worked from 9:30 p.m. to 7:45 a.m. At various points, I was sitting in a booth, and at other points, I was walking around. The weekend before Thanksgiving, I remember being on shift and having the night that I quit and found a new job because of. So I'm patrolling around the perimeter of one of the main buildings. There's night shift workers inside, and this plant operates 24/7. I hear them working away as usual. My walkie goes off though, and someone other than my main shift boss tells me to go check out behind the auxiliary building. Now I only divert usually when my shift boss tells me to. I didn't recognize this voice, so I call back asking for them to ask what's up. My actual shift boss replies this time asking me what I'm talking about, and I tell him someone said to check the auxiliary building. He said no one said that, and to stay at my patrol area. I think I'm being bamboozled, but I stay and I keep patrolling. About an hour later, the same message comes back and someone tells me that I need to go check out the field behind the auxiliary building. I make the same call back and my boss says the same thing. Apparently, I'm the only one hearing it. Eventually, shifts change. My boss leaves 2 hours before I do, and there's a 40-minute gap between shift bosses sometimes, if for whatever reason, They take a while switching. During that gap, the voice comes back to my channel, telling me to go to the auxiliary building again. The auxiliary building is empty during the night. It's away from the main plant and faces the woods surrounding the land, just for reference. I ignore it, and I wait for my main shift manager. I call a few other guards though, and I ask if anyone has seen anything near the auxiliary building, and I tell them what I've been hearing. They all deny hearing anything. One agrees to go look since they're nearby though, much closer than me. Eventually he says nothing is up near the building, and it's all clear. I finish my shift and I start driving away from the plant. I pass by the auxiliary building on my way out, and just out of curiosity I glance over to it. There's like 15 people standing next to a tree line of the woods behind the auxiliary building, all wearing red from head to toe. I was contracted, and at will, I told my boss I couldn't continue. I was too spooked. It turns out the same guard who checked for me quit shortly after that.
I was working with the emergency services, and I was standing outside our station, smoking a cigarette at about 3 a.m. Our garage and workshop were around 30 feet from me, and the garage door started to open. I got about halfway and stopped. I opened the door into the station, thinking it was my partner trying to mess around, but he was still unconscious on the couch and hadn't moved from the position he assumed a few hours earlier. The door suddenly begins to close on its own, and I stare at the dilapidated building that held our ambulances and stockroom. The heavy metal door next to the garage slowly opens, and I hear a voice yell, "Hey, Jessica, come here," from the direction of the garage. It was loud enough for my partner to wake up, and we came outside wondering who was yelling for me. It was a gruff, masculine voice, and it called out again, "Jessica, come here." Both my partner and I heard it, and we just stared at each other. The inside of the garage was pitch black, so we couldn't see anyone. We called up PD and told them what we thought we heard, and that we thought someone was screwing around in the garage with us, and a couple of officers came up. We all started walking towards the garage, when the door, which was 3/4 of the way open, just slammed shut. We all turned around and ran. One of the officers called the K9 officer, and he came down with his pup. They were going to do a search of the building, but the pup wouldn't get any closer to the building than about 10 feet away. The dog got close to the building, fear-peed, and jerked backwards so hard on his lead that his head slipped out of his collar and he ran back into the car, scratching to get back in. Not gonna lie, we ended up calling a priest because none of us wanted to deal with whatever was in that garage. It was the weirdest thing ever. The priest came down and he fearlessly walked into the building, then immediately came back out shaking. He said the moment he crossed the threshold he felt pure evil and hatred. Those were his exact words. He blessed the building, and, mind you, there were 4 cops, 2 paramedics, and a couple of firefighters standing around. We all suddenly felt our ears pop. We all yelped and reached for our ears at the same time. I've flown a few times and done rock climbing in various altitudes, and I've never felt my ears pop like that before or since. It was so painful it gave us all headaches. All of us are rational and sane people, yet none of us could explain exactly what was going on. PD did a search of the building, and they found nothing. The dog didn't even pick up a trail. We all joked that the building was haunted, but none of us believed it until then. Strange shit continued to happen to the building. The garage bay doors would open and close by themselves. The main door, which was a double deadbolt, would open and slam shut, and voices would call out to people. Tons of wild, bizarre shit. Oddly enough, the service closed a few years ago, and the building was condemned. It burned down just a few weeks ago.
I worked the audit shift at my hotel, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. One night during the winter, I got a call from a room about screaming from the floor below them. Our hotel is only 6 stories high. They were on the 5th floor, so that means the room they were complaining about was on the 4th floor because it's set up as a ground floor, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. I said I would check it out for them, and I was kinda reluctant because, as an audit, I'm the only worker in the whole building at night. Before I went up though, I looked in the system to see if there was any rooms near them so that I could narrow it down. Here's the creepy part for me. It was in the winter, so there wasn't many people in the building. In fact, there weren't any rooms near the one on the 5th floor, and there wasn't any single guest staying on the 4th. I went up and I investigated, but the room directly under the other guest's door was wide open, which should be impossible being it uses a key card system. Thinking it was just left open by housekeeping, I looked in there to see if anyone was in there and closed the door. I told the guests from the 5th floor that it must have just been some kids running down the hall. An hour later, they said they heard screaming again and banging below them. I went up there and the door was open again. At this point, it was a security concern because someone has access to a room they shouldn't have. So I decided to watch the security footage from the 4th floor. In the video, the door clearly opens. Most freaky thing I have ever seen. I wrote a ticket to maintenance to check the door in the morning, and they said it was fine. I showed the video to my boss, and he was freaked out too. We ended up moving the guests to the other side of the building because they were spooked. To add on to this, when maintenance went in there to check the door before they opened it, they heard banging in the room. When they came in, the screen door to the balcony was wide open. I don't really believe in paranormal stuff, but no one could explain what happened. And from then on, I have been really hesitant at night just to go up to the 4th floor on my rounds. My manager ended up filing an incident report just to have on the records.
I used to work in group homes for individuals with developmental disabilities. This home in particular was considered a high support, as the individuals there were relatively aggressive and their needs were mostly behavioral. The home itself was in the middle of nowhere, 15 minutes from the closest town. No cell reception really, and surrounded by forest, aside from a couple of other houses on the road. There were 2 overnight staff. Usually one would be awake and one asleep, and they would take turns. Anyway, the staff told me about one night where they heard noises coming from one of the people living in the house's room. I guess that person had decided to rip open a scab and use the blood to smear all over the walls of their room. One staff went to deal with the situation, and the individual said, "Don't worry, they're coming tonight." The other member of staff walked back out into the open concept living room / kitchen / dining area to get the phone to call the on-call supervisor and let them know, since this required a lot of documentation and notifying on the call. The staff noticed that the sliding door was now somehow ajar by about a foot, even though they had just been in that room and the door was closed and locked. While the other staff members began walking towards it, the staff noticed a wolf / coyote lurking on the porch towards the open door. They closed the door and ended up calling the police because they didn't know what the hell was going on. They had to clean all the bloody hand smears off the wall, and the individual didn't talk about it again. Just another overnight, I suppose.
This story comes from my time as a resident assistant about 3 years ago at a large university in the southern U.S. Contrary to popular belief, RAs are not hired to be professional buzzkills. We are actually there to promote a safe living environment and encourage the personal growth of our residents. Pretty corny, yes, I am aware. This particular story is about a time when one of my residents was in a very unsafe situation, and I happened to be there to help out. My first year as an RA, I lived on the 12th floor of our dorm, and the dorm housed over 500 freshman guys. Our university always gives a 3 or 4 day weekend between the end of classes and the beginning of finals, and this experience happened during that break right before spring finals in May, after which most people, they go home for the summer. A vast majority of the homesick freshmen in my building had also headed home for the long weekend. It was quiet. I spent my entire Saturday locked in a room studying, literally, 12 hours with barely a lunch break, and I was brain dead when I emerged at about 9 p.m. I intended to get some quick food and immediately go to bed, but I ran into some friends who convinced me that I needed to blow off steam after my study marathon. So I went to their apartment and we watched movies and played video games until about 2 a.m. I was completely out of it by that point. I stumbled back into my building, brain dead and sleep deprived. I passed the front desk and I said a polite hello to the overnight desk attendant, who I knew well, and headed for the bed. As soon as I had stripped down and cuddled into a bed for well-deserved sleep, my phone rang. It was my friend, Gary, calling from the front desk. I dumbly answered. McAllister's sweet tea. Some girl just cussed me out and ran into the elevators and disappeared. She was yelling and screaming and just seemed messed up. Can you go check her out? Context. Guys only dorm. Girls only allowed when escorted by a guy. Safety reasons. Gary, I am not on call tonight. It has been a long day. He says, I know. I just figured you'll still be awake since I just saw you. I didn't want to wake anyone else up. All right, fine. What floor did she go to? I get out of bed, throw on some sweats, and I head down to the 10th floor, fully expecting this girl's boyfriend to have already let her into his room and leaving me with nothing to go find or do. Thanks, Gary. I get to the 10th floor, and I check the first hallway. No one is there. Just as I expected. I walk over to the second hallway, but a lady is actually there, standing in the hallway. Her arms are hanging down at her sides and her head is hung down and tilted to one side. It was like she was staring at where the wall and the floor meet, just beside her left foot, if that makes sense. Not a natural resting position. I walk up to her, and I stand about 15 feet away from her right side. She was looking down to her left, and politely say something along the lines of, "Excuse me, ma'am, but you can't be here without an escort who lives in the building. I'm going to have to ask you to come back downstairs with me, please." No response. She stands completely still with her head still tilted. "Ma'am, it is now 2:30 in the morning. You can't be here. I am sleepy, and I am just doing my job. Can you please come to the front desk with me?" No response or movement. "Listen, I don't feel like doing any paperwork for this. You won't be in trouble. Just come with me, and I will let you use my phone to call your boyfriend and he can come get you. I need you to come with me for your safety, please. If you don't come with me, I have to call the police department and have them escort you out of the building, and then I have to do a lot of paperwork." Just before I dialed the last digit to my supervisor, The girl looks at me. By looks at me, I mean she rotated her head towards me. She was staring down the whole time, but rotated her head so she was no longer looking at the ground on her left, but directly at me on her right. While staring at me, she said, "Do you know what happened 3 days ago?" Then rotated her head back away from me and towards the wall like I found her. At this point, I am thinking that this is a weird scenario and question, but at least she is talking to me right now. Maybe I won't have to wake anyone else up and call the cops for something dumb, so I respond, "No. What happened 3 days ago?" She rotates her head towards me, otherwise perfectly still, and laughs a loud, boisterous yet feminine laugh. She then rotated her head away again, then rotated back to me and said, "You really don't know." Politely, I said, "Nope." Jesus Christ was reborn 3 days ago, she says with a wild, toothy smile on her otherwise lovely face. Then she moves her body for the first time and pointed at the door at the end of the hall and said, "Jesus was reborn 3 days ago, and he is in that room." Then she returns to her frozen position staring at the floor. Remember, at this point, I'm sleep deprived and brain dead, and on some level, I realize that this is really freaky and potentially dangerous, but mostly, I just want the situation to end, so I'll play along. So I asked her, "Does Jesus have a cell phone? Because you can call him from mine downstairs, and I'm sure he will come escort you." Of course he has a cell phone, but he is not answering my calls. Okay, now I'm done. I pick up my phone to call my supervisor to let him know what's going on. And just then she turns to me again. "Can you help me with something?" Again, trying to be a nice guy and not wake others up, I take it as a good sign that she is still talking to me. I decide to continue to play along so that hopefully we can resolve this quickly and quietly. I say, "I would love to help you. How about you help me, then I help you?" She nodded and froze up for another moment before asking something under her breath. Then she asked again, this time louder, "I need you to take care of the booby trap for me." What? Then she points to something I hadn't previously noticed. Directly blocking her path to the door where Jesus Christ himself supposedly resided was a rope. The rope was tied to doorknobs on either side of the hallway. A classic freshman prank which prevents the occupants of either room from opening their doors. Apparently this practical joke, it looked to her like a tripwire. One which she was very concerned about and had undoubtedly led her to her trance-like state. I told her that I would take care of the booby trap, which was a fire hazard anyway. If people can't get out of their rooms, it's a fire hazard. If she came downstairs with me, she remained stock still until finally she turned towards me, yelled something unintelligible, and charged the booby trap, still yelling. She actually leaped over it and charged towards Jesus' room. Now I finally panic. I follow her in hot pursuit, resting assured that Jesus surely had the sense not to open the door to this now screaming lady. I pulled out my phone and called my supervisor, Alan, who, in a haze of sleepiness and skepticism about my 30-second summary of the situation, told me not to call the police and wait for him. Sure, Alan. At this point, she was banging on Jesus' door, and I was just praying he wouldn't be dumb enough to open it. Surely he wouldn't be dumb enough to open it. Surely. Finally, this screaming lady decides to take a break from banging on the door with both hands and tries the doorknob, turning the handle. Click. The door is unlocked. I'm right behind her, frozen in panic as she enters the room. Fortunately, all of the bedroom doors in the dorm were locked. but she was quite literally in their general room now, banging on the interior doors and yelling just as loudly. I am still frozen watching this happen. Eventually she gives up, turns and sees me, and screams at me before running out of the apartment, by me and down the stairwell. I turn and follow, and then my night gets even more surreal. Strewn all the way down the 10 flights of stairs are broken pieces of futon, wet floor warning signs, random debris, and inexplicable spatters of white paint. Literally, more broken junk on every flight. I follow her all the way down and out of the building into the courtyard below, where she runs 50 yards from the building and turns to watch me as I return to the lobby to meet up with Gary and Alan and fill them in. As soon as I finish explaining, I turn to see 2 young men walk into our lobby, one of whom is on crutches. Ducking behind them is, you guessed it, the lady from the 10th floor. I whisper, "Alan, that's her behind them." Alan now takes control of the situation. He's about 6'3" and looks about 23 years old. He looks like a younger Barack Obama if he were a bodybuilder. I'm relieved just to be the backup now. Alan stops the 3 of them. "Guys, is she with you?" Both of whom shake their head furiously, and it's quite obvious they are trying to get away from her, but are slowed significantly by crutches. Alan lets the boys slip past him and into the elevator, but tries to stop the lady by putting his arms out and trying to coil her in without touching her. Touching is generally a no-no in these situations, and calmly saying something along the lines of, "I'm going to need you to stop here for a minute." Instead, she grabs his arm, lifts it up, and walks under it, and joins the 2 gentlemen on the elevator, both of whom are freaking out and huddled into one corner, while she stands in her all too familiar position in the opposite corner. Alan also stepped onto the elevator and held the doors open. The guys got off and took the stairs, even though they were on crutches, as Alan spoke calmly with the lady from the 10th floor, who showed no signs of budging. Eventually, the elevator door alarms were going off, and Alan hopped all the way onto the elevator as it headed back up to the 10th floor. I again panicked as they were stuck in a confined space together, and I booked it up in hot pursuit. By the time that I arrived, the lady was running from one end of the hallway to the other, screaming and banging on random doors. The aforementioned booby trap had been taken care of by Alan. Alan was calmly walking behind her while on the phone with police. When she changed direction and ran past him, he slowly turned and followed her the other way. I began to follow Alan in the same fashion until the lady ran back to the elevators, pushed the down button, and stopped, returning to her previous stance. Alan and I also waited. The elevator came, and the lady stood in a corner in the same fashion, and Alan and I occupied 2 of the other corners and quietly waited as we descended back onto the ground floor. The lady looked at Alan, made her hand into a shape of a gun, and shot it at Alan, then said, "Screw you." She then looked at me, shot me with her finger pistol, and repeated the phrase. When we got to the ground floor, she stepped off the elevator. We followed. She froze. We stayed. Eventually, she just started laughing again and looked straight into Alan's eyes and asked him, "What's your favorite animal?" She then returned to her now classic frozen stance with her head down. Alan and I, we exchanged a confused look and remained silent. She repeated her question. After a moment, Alan sheepishly replied, "A hyena, I guess." She began laughing again, and then her body suddenly unfroze and she slowly walked toward Alan. "You wouldn't want to make me angry. You would not enjoy it. When I get angry, I'm gonna come at you. I'm gonna come at you. I'm gonna come at you like a hyena." And she returns to her laughter, which sounds progressively unhinged. Now I'm fully aware of how hilarious this sounds, but When I was there in the moment, it was more freaky or scary than funny. She eventually freaked out. She shouted out some more and turned on her heel towards the door and straight into the two police officers on the other side. The officers tried to stop her to question her and immediately began to fight against them. She literally just went wild. And the officers had to team up to put her in handcuffs. I just stood there in awe and watched as they just wrestled her into the car, waited for backup, and then came back to take our statements. We eventually found out that she was also a student at the university who had been stalking the resident who lived in that room. She had come off of her medicine and had a breakdown which resulted in this story.
I used to work in a psychiatric hospital. I would work on several different floors, wherever they needed extra staffing. So I was sent to work on the kids' floor, and I was unfamiliar with this set of patients. One little boy of around 8 years old needed to constantly be observed during his stay, because he was aggressive. When he was sleeping, this usually just meant the staff can pull a chair and watch from his doorway. The patient sheets reported that he had auditory and visual hallucinations. He would wake up throughout the night, frequently, by sitting up and turning his head from side to side, scanning the room. He would then look at me and say, "Oh, it's just you." He did this a few times, and I just chalked it up to having psychotic symptoms. Then I saw a dark shadow whiz around the room, but the patient remained asleep. The next morning he wakes up and sits at the table on the unit. I tried to start up some small talk and ask him how he slept, and he said tearfully, "I couldn't sleep because the shadow people wouldn't let me sleep." Then he stared off into space with a flat effect, and he said, "Disappointment." Then looked at me and smiled. I was really weirded out by his whole shift and was telling one of the nurses who regularly worked at the hospital, and she said, "Oh, Jason is sleeping in room 115, isn't he?" "Yeah, that room is haunted. Most kids have trouble sleeping in that room." Then she told me about how the children's floor used to be the old electroconvulsive therapy unit back when the technique had just been introduced, and it wasn't the most humane procedure. The building was built back in 1940, and this era was known for the inhumane treatment of patients.
I work graveyards 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. on weekends, and I get to sit at a desk for Halloween this year. Anyways, one night, after our night cleaner had been fired, the trash bins were full, and I was most appropriately the one to empty them. I collected all the trash one by one in this large warehouse-like gym with nobody there but myself. I watched too many horror movies, so I try to avoid eye contact with all the mirrors lining the gym walls. I was really starting to freak myself out, and I still had to get to the bathroom trash cans. I walked through the bathroom, dedicating eye contact equally to the shower curtains and underneath the bathroom stalls. I wasn't gonna die today, boy. So I got all the trash and I rallied it into the corner and far back by the door to the dark-ass alleyway with the dumpster. I had never used this door, but I swear it was designed as an elaborate prank with a hidden camera somewhere. This door was emblazoned with the words, "Fire exit, blah blah blah, loud alarm." Yet this is the door that I am supposed to open. Who does that? I've seen the night guy use the door, but I couldn't help but think how disastrous it would be if I decided to use this door and an annoying siren goes off and fire people come. Just this one time, it would happen. So I build up my mojo. I'm gonna open this door, I say to myself. I'm gonna conquer the ghost of the gym after this because I'm so pumped. Yeah. Alright. I grab the bags and I open the door. No alarm. Cool. But I hear a rustling as something dives into the dumpster ahead of me before I can turn my head. I freak the hell out and manage to say, "Please tell me you're a human," which is a terrible request because a demon would probably just lie and say yes. I see this dark figure rise out of the dumpster while I'm fetal position near the door, and it's a bloody dumpster diver. So after I recompose my composure, my first thought is maybe he wants me to put the trash on him, huh? Just keep doing my job. And my second thought is no, that's ridiculous. He was obviously homeless, so I told him to do what he had to do, but I would have to throw away this trash at some point. I come back later to take out the trash, and that mysterious man of Musk was long gone. Legend has it that he's still out there, working a part-time job and really getting a hold of his life.
I worked security at a youth camp that was closing down. The layout was exactly like a prison. Barbed wire fences around the whole campgrounds, big double gates that only could be opened from the control booth. I would be the only one there and set up in the control room on the 3 to 11 p.m. shift. All I did was watch movies on my computer all night. The place was already creepy, just as sight. The control room was an enclosed room with a huge steel door, and it was the only way in. On many nights, I would hear someone trying to open the door, but the only way to open it was for me to buzz it open. Another night, while zoning out to the clerks, I heard one of the doors open in the hall. I just got up to look, to catch the door closing, followed by a guy's voice that sounded like, "Hey." I just sat down and watched the movie. Not much I could do. The weirdest thing that happened was hearing what sounded like a mop bucket being rolled across the floor. When I get up, a second later, nothing. It happened a few more times until I went to check it out, and at the end of the hall, the mop bucket was sitting in the middle of the hall with a mop, completely dry. I know for a fact it wasn't there at the start of my shift. Other guards had some stories too, and the place is now a manufacturing plant for medical marijuana.
I was doing an overnight shift at a halfway house where I worked in college. Me and my colleague were in the office just bullshitting when we see on a security camera someone walking through the alley. People try to escape and people taking off is pretty common, so I thought it was a resident taking off in the middle of the night. I tell her to stay in the office as I go out to the side door that leads in the alley the dude was going down. Well, there's one camera facing down one way and the other camera in the opposite direction. When I get outside, no one is there. I radio back to the girl and she's telling me that he has to be. She was watching him walk from one camera and didn't see him in the next. So she thought he was under our cameras or something. There's nothing in the alley besides a few telephone poles with buildings on each side. I lit a cigarette and tried listening, but nothing. There's nowhere he could have been. We watched the cameras again and sure as shit, everything is current of what we saw. We did a quick resident check and everyone was accounted for. So, I don't know who this mystery guy was or where the hell he went.
I was working night shift at UPS Unload. As a manager there, I had a radio with me to coordinate with the incoming trucks. I'm going to give you the basic process, just so that you have a little context to the story. So, when a truck comes in, I have to say which bay they come to, so the monitors can get the packages to the next destination. Now that being said, At the time, a colleague of mine used to bring breakfast. When she arrived, she would announce it on the radio so that we could all come down and partake in the feast. So, as one of my trucks was coming into the bay, I heard it loud and clear that there was food. So I started to make my way down to the break room and get myself something to eat. But when I arrived, there was no one there. I got on the radio and asked my colleague about it, and there was no answer. I called her on a cell phone, and there was no answer still. At this point, I think I'm about to be someone's practical joke. Fast forward the story to the following, and I found out that she had died in a car accident the same time I heard the announcement. That news really hit me, and I started to scratch my head regarding what I heard. I am 100% sure I heard her voice on the radio that day, and no matter how many times I think about it, I know what I heard. I do believe that there are things out there that we humans are not meant to understand, or may never understand. But this is something that will always haunt me.
I used to work an audit shift at an hotel in France, 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. One night during the summer, I began one of my rounds and I heard some commotion. So naturally, I went to check it out. Big property, hotel and camping grounds, sort of a domain. A couple of pools, a playground for kids, and tall Mediterranean pines. They don't look like Christmas trees. And one night, I had the thought creep up in my mind that it reminds me of the original Slender Man game. What with me walking around in the dark with a flashlight seemingly alone. Ironic. So I approached the area where these loud noises were coming from and realized there are some young folks drinking and smoking, probably not cigarettes. So I chat with them a bit and I explained that as long as I get no complaints, they can have their fun, as long as they are conscious of the noise levels. One of them turns out to be traveling in his van and he offers to tattoo me for any amount of money. He's got all the gear in his van. I explain I'd rather not have my first tattoo be an impulsive tattoo that I might later regret getting. He's cool about it. We laugh. They offer me a drink and smoke. I respectively decline because I'm on duty. The chatter continues, and now that we're all buddy-buddy, the time has come to divulge more information. So the tattoo artist takes out a big brown brick of something and explains that it's hash, and that he's invested into this to fund his vacation. So now things start getting interesting because that's not all he's got. Now he's showing off an Uzi with a scope attached to it. Why the scope? It beats me. He asked if I'd like to hold it. So I said, yeah, I agree. We're buddy-buddy now, so I don't want to offend this hash dealing, Uzi wielding tattoo artist, now do I? So now that's all said and done, I figured it's probably best to remove myself from the situation and hope that I receive no complaints.
I worked at Kohl's for 2 years, and right before Christmas, there would be a shit ton of new merchandise. So they usually had a team of about 12 people stay overnight and get the new Christmas merchandise out. I volunteered. It did mean extra pay, and we were winding down at about 2:30 a.m. I'm in the back near the bedding, which, in my particular store, was right beside the stockroom, in the back corner of the store. There's an end cap, with some picture frames that were on clearance to my left, and I'm trying to stuff in some comforters a few aisles away. I get done, and back up, and look at the awful job, and a picture just tips over and crashes on the floor. No one was around me. Nothing even touched the picture frames. I was too tired to care, so I went to the back and grabbed a broom and a dustpan from the housekeeping closet. This closet is way back in the stockroom. and we have these conveyor belts that you hang clothes on, and they'll take them around a track, close to the ceiling, so our stockroom wouldn't be packed with clothes. Housewares and stuff were on the shelves, but the clothes hung in plastic bags from the conveyor belts at the ceiling. So I turned the corner to the closet, and there's a bag of women's clothes just swinging away above me. No other bags were swinging, and this thing was loud. If anyone had just used it, I would have heard it. By now I'm wide awake and freaked out. I grabbed the broom and ran out to wherever the broken picture frame was, but it had been picked up. There was no glass despite me hearing it shatter, and I couldn't get any of the other employees to admit they cleaned it up. I never worked an overnight shift after that, and I always got super creeped out using the conveyor belt.
This happened a couple years ago, working security at a big industrial complex overnight. Well, around 5 a.m. people start coming in for work and we just check IDs for all those people. Well, one Friday morning, a guy comes in and looks kinda drunk and face plants on the concrete in front of us. His face was bloody as I helped him up and my partner called for a medic. Well, this attracted the attention of about a dozen people coming through, and he stumbled off to a porta potty about 10 yards away, and I assumed he was embarrassed or just getting some tissue for his bloody nose. About 30 seconds later, we hear a gunshot ring out from inside the porta potty. We got down inside the guard shack and people run for the hill screaming. About a minute after the gunshot, LEO pulls up and we tell them what occurred. Then the SWAT team shows up and about a minute later, we are rushed away to the parking lot. The guy killed himself in the porta potty. The next day we learned he had a note and was intending on killing his supervisor and a few co-workers during morning team meeting, but after falling, and the attention that brought, he changed his plans. I changed jobs soon after.
I work at night from home. I'm going to share my only story. So this happened about 10 years ago. My wife and I moved into our brand new condo in July of 2005. So we were new to the area and knew no one besides my dad. Fast forward to April 2007. We had some weird things, such as the TV turning on in the middle of the night, and a few glasses shattering on their own when no one was around. Strange, but we just explained it as new construction / wiring, and perhaps the glasses were weakened by the move or age. A likely story. We joke about it, and in a week I'm due to drive back to Chicago to do my oral defense for my master's degree. I take showers daily, as does my wife. I don't remember the actual dates, but let's just say Monday my wife and I take our showers. No worries. Tuesday I take a shower and get out. Our bathroom has a full wall mirror over the dual sinks. In the steam, at the very top, is written Chicago. I'm like, that's odd. I call my wife to ask her, why did you write that? She's just walking up and comes in. She's confused as hell and starts to get angry because she didn't write it. I quickly write in the steam below without thinking, as does she. The writing doesn't match either of ours. Plus it's written at the top of the mirror. We have 10-foot ceilings. Both of us would either have had to gotten onto the counter and stood on it to reach it. I run through the condo. It's not very big, and everything is locked. We've had no people over in between the daily showers, and hadn't had anyone over in weeks, and we still don't know many people here. My wife is not a prankster. She's never pranked me in the 2 decades I've known her, and I'm sure as hell she didn't write it. The kicker. The next night, I had an incredibly realistic dream of my grandma, who passed in '05. She was on the bed, rested her hand on my leg and said, "Don't worry, Brandon. That bastard is gone." Nothing weird happened after that. I can explain away everything, except the writing though. Who knows what that was?
I used to work overnights doing phone support. Let me just say that the area in general we worked at has always had a weird vibe to it. Stuff that doesn't seem exactly out of place, but just abnormal and, in a way that's difficult to explain. To make matters worse, there's a cemetery about a mile up the road, and it can kind of get in your head when you're thinking about it. Off the top of my head, I experienced weird lights in the sky. Not your typical that might be an airplane, but as in coworkers and I would be outside and see a light off in the distance hovering. It would move up vertically, make a sudden and quick horizontal downward slope, go up vertically again and take off. Strange lights in the building across the street from us. A big building, not sure how many stories, but very tall. It was abandoned up until this year for maybe 4 years or so. Occasionally lights would come on, go off, come on again. You could see that what looked like people roaming around with flashlights. You would hear singing late at night outside, all throughout the year. Definitely a woman's voice. Couldn't make out what was being sang, could never find out where it was coming from. There were co-worker doppelgangers. Stones would be thrown at us from seemingly nowhere. There was like a very, very small little pond next to the building, surrounded entirely by a fence and high grass. Sometimes it sounded like something massive had jumped inside of it, followed by heavy sounding steps.